My father lived in Krasnobrod with his sisters. He had two sisters, two older sisters, and his mother and his grandfather. I don't know who his father was. That remains a mystery. In fact, I've spent probably the last 10 years trying to hunt down my grandfather because the story my father told about his own father was not really accurate. And as I've learned more about his upbringing, it seems pretty clear that he lived in a household that was dominated by females with his two older sisters and his mother. And they were very capable females. So here actually are a couple of pictures of houses that existed in Krasnobrod before the war, during the time period where my father would have been growing up. They're actually from a book that I received in Krasnobrod, and they're not normally available to most people because, frankly, after World War II, there were not a lot of people that were, or a lot of pictures that were left to be able to disseminate to people. So let's have a little bit of context for where it is that my father was born and what was going on at the time. So you can see this is a map from 1917 for the end of World War I. And at the time of, at the end of World War I, Poland technically did not exist. We had Polish people, but the territory itself hadn't existed since the Franco-Prussian War. Poland was absorbed, as you can see, partially into Germany and partially into the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And so at the time, in 1917 and then in 1918, when my father was born, Krasnobrod was actually part of Galicia. And Galicia was the northernmost province of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So the interesting thing about Galicia is Galicia was also a haven for the Jewish population and the pogroms, where it is that the Jewish population was driven out of Russia. And Galicia is actually where it is that you would find Anatevka from Fiddler on the Roof. Anatevka was not a real place, but Anatevka was based on the city of Trochenbrod. And Trochenbrod was in Galicia, and it was, of course, one of the cities that met its terrible fate in World War II at the hands of the Nazis. But another interesting thing about where it is that my father was born is that because of its placement, that people there had to be multilingual. And so interestingly enough, my father's grandfather, I don't know if he was a professor, but he was a teacher, but he was also a communist. And he was part of the communist class, and they were trying to make a better world for the people of Poland. And because he was a communist, he was always on the run from the law. And so you can see where it is that the border lands are. And so whenever it is that he got word that somebody was looking for them, he'd simply cross the border. And so, you're in Germany on one day, and then you cross the border and you're in Austria-Hungary on the other day. And certainly Galicia had its own type of community. And the other thing, and this is really sort of common for Europe at the time, they were all multilingual. And by multilingual, they spoke German, and they spoke Polish, and they spoke functional Yiddish, and they also spoke Russian. And in order to get along from day to day, it sort of depended on who it is that you were dealing with. And in many respects, the language that you spoke was a language of survival. This is a map of Krasnobrod that my father drew for me, Krasnobrod as it existed prior to the Nazi invasion. What my father also listed, and you can't read it obviously on the left-hand picture, but he listed the names of all of his neighbors and all of the people that he could remember, and trying to remember their addresses in the different portions of Krasnobrod. And you can see the marking in black. That's actually the river that runs through Krasnobrod, and where it is that he and his friends swam. And then you'll see on the right side, my father noted where the synagogue was in Krasnobrod. So it's interesting about all of these cities in Poland for those of you who've gone to the Holocaust Museum, you will see all of the shtetls that are listed, the ones that were destroyed by the Nazis during World War II. And Krasnobrod was one of these. And the thing about Krasnobrod is it was not completely Jewish. It was, I would say, 40% Jewish. The Jewish community was, they like lived in their own neighborhoods, but it was a small enough village that really their existence as between each other was interrelated. So yes, there were the school non-Jewish students went to, and then the Jewish schools and the Jewish community. But as my father said, on market day, everybody was together, and certainly in terms of the services, everybody was together. So everybody in these communities, they really did know each other, and they knew each other, not just from afar, but they knew each other very personally. Okay. All right, so I just want to switch gears a little bit here, and we're going to go back to 1917. But this is a map of 1917, and what I'm pointing out there is where my mother's family came from. Okay? So as you can see in 1917, that whole area was Germany. And my mother's family, where that arrow is from a place that it's called, and it's still called, the Polish Corridor. And the Polish Corridor actually in historic times was part of Prussia. So in many respects, I suppose if we're looking at a nationality for my mother's side of the family, I am Prussian. My mother's family was from a province called Pomerania, and not surprisingly, that's where the Pomeranian dogs come from. It is near what is now Dansk in what is modern day Poland. So you can see, sort of what it is that's happening here. You've got individuals who are born in an area that, frankly, at one time was Poland, and depending on what the war happened to be on any given day, your family could be German and your family could be Polish. And as far as my mother's family is concerned, when her grandmother was born in this area, the country was Poland. And so these were, Polish folks, and they learned how to speak Poland. And then the next war came around, and, and then they're Germany. And now they're Germans, and they go to German schools, and they have to speak German language, and they change the currency, and you're not allowed to speak the other language. So within this Polish corridor, where my mother's family is from, they also had to be multilingual. And so my grandmother spoke Polish, and she spoke German. And as did my great grandmother. But an interesting thing, happened along the way, and that is, and then I'll go to the next slide. After World War I, and I don't know how familiar everybody is with Woodrow Wilson and what was established after World War I, but you can see here that we now again have a country called Poland. Okay? And this country called Poland, what it did then is it retook back Dansk, where my mother's family was from, so that it was, yet again Polish. Okay? And then you can see, and I hope you can, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but that little gray part against it, that was East Prussia, and they were Germans, so they were Germany. And so this plays a little bit of a role later on, because one of Hitler's aims was to reunite Germany through the Polish corridor in order to join Western Germany with the Eastern Prussian section. Okay. So you can see what it must have been like for these people who were in between. So sometimes they were part of Germany and sometimes they were part of Poland. Well, in my mother's family in particular, when my grandmother was born, she was born in Poland. Okay? When her two sisters were born, they were born in Germany. And when my youngest uncle and his sister were born, they were born in Poland. Okay? So, keep this in mind, because my two aunts that were born when this area was Germany, they spoke only functional Polish. Okay? And when my youngest uncle and aunt were born, they didn't speak German. Okay? They spoke Polish. And so when the war broke out, you had two sisters who spoke mostly German, and their brother, who was a Polish soldier who spoke Polish. Okay? And this was not anything at all that was uncommon. This was something, and for those of you who have read Madeleine Albright's book, this is exactly the same, and that was in Czech and Slovakia, where it is that you had these pockets of people, and some days you needed to be German, and some days you needed to be Czech, and some days you needed to be Slovak, and depended on who was in charge, and you could have a brother or a sister, and one day they are the enemy, at least according to the dictates of war. And these are how these people lived, and they lived this way for generations. So on the left side, this is a picture of my grandmother and her husband. Now, here's another interesting twist to my situation. The man in the left picture, his name is Peter Panov, and Peter Panov is Russian. And he was born in Moscow, and he had a Russian family. And in World War I, he was serving in the Russian army, and they were in Germany, because Germany was the enemy. And he was a prisoner of war in World War I. And in the middle of the war, of course, there's a revolution in this country. So he never goes back. So here's another thing to keep in mind. Remember, my grandmother there, she was born Polish, but after World War I, there was no work in that area. And so she spoke German. She had German citizenship because, they had sort of a dual citizenship. So she and her two sisters went to Germany, and they went to Essen, Germany. And that's where it is that she, married this Russian prisoner of war who did not go back to Russia. Okay. Now, on the right side there, my mother there is in the middle of the picture, and those are her two older brothers, and they lived in Essen, in the western part of Germany. Okay. But they had a little bit of a problem there, at least a little bit of a problem when Adolf Hitler became chancellor, and that was they had a Russian last name, and so it was very problematic because even though Germany and Russia bounded themselves together as far as what they were going to do in Poland, they weren't friends, right? And so there was persecution if you were Russian. And so the fact that they had a Russian last name, that in many respects made them Russian, and so they endured a fair amount of persecution themselves once Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. My mother was born in 1939, or rather 1929, and then in 1930, her father passed away. And then literally within the next couple of years, in order to evade the persecution of Hitler, my grandmother's family, married her off literally to the town drunk. And the reason that they did this was because he had a German last name. And frankly, when my grandmother married the Russian, she lost German citizenship. That's how it is that it worked. And when you lost German citizenship, that meant unless people gave you money, you didn't get any advantages from the German government. That is, no pension or no welfare or no medical care, no status as a person. And so she wound up having to marry really a pretty heinous individual. And that was my mother's stepfather. And I know it's a story for another day, but, her life was a living hell because of that as well. A lot of things going on there. So in Essen is the home of Krupp. And Krupp is the arms manufacturer. And of course, Hitler's regime, his idea was, of course, to build up the German army. And then he worked with Krupp and the arms manufacturers there in order to build up the arsenal in order to attack the rest of Europe. Okay? And another interesting thing about Adolf Hitler, and I think now, many years later, we can most uniformly demonize him. And there's a lot of talk about what was going on at the time and how nobody really interceded in what it is that was happening. And the fact of the matter is that sort of like Vladimir Putin these days, he had his fans. And the reason that he had his fans was sort of twofold. One of it was that he was anti-communist, and communism was not a popular thing. But the other thing was that the world wasn't wrong. When you start having border changes, the people who are there, who are of a different ethnicity, they are abused. And one of the promises that Hitler made was that he was going to go to the other countries and make sure that the ethnic Germans weren't abused. And, that sounded sort of really a good thing if you're one of the people who's in an ethnic minority and you're being abused. That's exactly what it is that you want to have happen. And I think although the world was on edge, they sort of wanted to see what would happen. I mean, I don't think anybody really wanted to go and endure another war. But, I think, as we all know, it got pretty bad, and it got bad pretty fast. I also wanted to point out that there really was a difference in the Jewish populations throughout Europe. So, I think many people, or at least who study this, know that the German Jewish population was in large measure assimilated. And, that was a lot different than the Polish population, where the communities were segregated, and certainly different than the Hungarian populations and populations in other countries. So different things happened in the chronology to the different Jewish populations throughout Europe. The hatred was there across the board, but I don't think he could have gotten away with what ultimately happened to the Jewish populations in countries outside of Germany at the onset. Obviously, that escalated quickly. But the intriguing thing about Poland is that not only was the Jewish population despised and regarded as not worth being alive, but the Polish population was as well. And originally, although most of the concentration camps were in Poland, they were not filled with the Polish Jewish population. They were actually filled with, started out with Hungarian Jewish population. And the Polish Jewish population, they didn't even make it to the level of concentration camps because the Nazis simply went in and killed everybody. The Poles, yes, they had no restraint in wanting to see the Poles dead, but what they wanted to do first was, of course, ship them to German areas so that they could be the slave labor. So as opposed to simply outright shooting people, it was simply killing them through the work that they would perform for Germany. Now, let's shift back to Krasnobrid here. So in 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland from the west. The Russians came in from the east. There was a very big battle in Krasnobrid at the time. My father was in the military, and he was an engineer. And at the time that there was the invasion of Poland, he was basically told, their unit was told, head to the Romanian border. Maybe you can find sanctuary there. But first, get rid of any indication that you're part of the Polish army, so you don't want to get shot. And so that's what they did, and they headed to the Romanian border. But they got there and it was closed, and so they wound up basically running into the Russian army. And the Russian army and the members of the Russian army, my father said, they just said, silly boy, silly children, go home, just go home. And, so that's what he did. And so my father then, he walked back to Krasnobrod with his friend. It was 90 kilometers. And in, I guess, the rain, it was September, it was not warm. Walked 90 kilometers. And when he arrived in Krasnobrod, this is what it is that he saw. There were only 2 buildings actually that were left over in Krasnobrod at the time. Ultimately, what he did and what everybody did was, they asked, have you seen my mother? Have you seen my family? Have you seen, this? Have you seen this person? And ultimately, he did find his mother and his 2 sisters, and they found shelter. It was outside the city. I think it was in a nearby village. They were all huddled in a house. And so, at that point, what occurred was occupation, and the Nazis arrived, and what they did was they would have all of the members of the community. Remember, not the Jewish people, because they were shooting them if they saw them, but the Poles, and they would arrive basically for a roll call in the morning and given work to do, which was oftentimes clearing up what had happened from the war. And occasionally the Russians would show up, and they'd do the same, and then the Germans would return. This is actually a plaque in Krasnobrod, and it's dedicated, of course, to the soldiers who died in 1939. What ultimately occurred is the Germans then, they said to all of the boys, the Polish boys, you're going to Germany. And so that's exactly what it is that happened with my father. He was, loaded with his contemporaries on a boxcar. They didn't know where they were going. Occasionally they would stop and somebody would jump out, and that person would get shot. Ultimately, they wound up in Germany, and they basically, what they did was they took the men, the boys, from place to place in the it was the smaller communities, because they needed laborers, right? They needed laborers for the factories. They needed laborers for the farm. And what they would do is they would put them on a stand and have the farmers or the business owners of the community check them out, poke them, prod them, squeeze their muscles, then select them for whatever it is that they needed to do. Now, my father was first selected by a farmer. Now, remember, my father was an engineer, right? And the Germans had, at least those Germans, had a preconceived notion that all Poles were completely uncivilized and uneducated, and they were only good, as oxes and able to lift and carry things and place things in, pick up things and put them in other places. So my father was not a farm worker, and he was selected for a farm. And at the end of the day, the farmer who had selected him took him back to the marketplace and said, he said that this one is defective, right? Give me somebody who can do something. And so then the Nazis who were organizing this, they threatened my father and put a gun to his head and said, you better learn how to work, or that was going to be your last day, because if this happens again, then you are done. And so my father was ultimately sent to a farm, and it was in the I would say probably maybe about 2 hours east of Essen. He was sent as a farm laborer to 2 hours east of Essen. And in the meantime, right, this is what's happening in Essen. So as you recall, Essen is the home of the Krupp factory. So once Hitler started bombing civilians in cities in London, of course, the British started to retaliate by bombing cities and civilians in Germany. And certainly once the United States started providing more materials and becoming involved in the war itself, then what they did was they they did start targeting the places where it is that the military machinery was going to be built. And of course, certainly Krupp was the main target because that's where it is that all of this machinery was being built. Well, my mother lived 2 blocks from Krupp, so it was not really a very good situation. And the other thing about Krupp at the time was that, you didn't have German men working there. The German men were in the German army. You had the slave laborers working at Krupp. And so with all of the bombing of Krupp, yes, the war machinery was destroyed, but the war machinery was being run by the slave laborers who had been shipped there from other countries. So, you can imagine it's pretty darn tragic all the way around. Now, meanwhile, back in Krasnobrud, right, they had no relief there. I mean, ultimately, the German goal was, kill everybody if at all possible, because frankly, what they were going to do, or the game plan at that point, was to expand into Germany. So because to make it a larger, think about urban sprawl, German homeland, so that the citizenry can move into have larger areas to live in. So in Krasnobrud, as I said, they had killed the entire Jewish population in some pretty heinous ways. And what was happening was, because it was a wooded area, of course, many people ran into the woods. And you had members of the Jewish community that were in the woods, living in the woods. And you also had those who were able to escape as Polish partisans, the partisans. And they were in the woods, and then they would, of course, do things like, have sneak attacks on the Germans from the woods. And of course, then the Nazis would retaliate in kind. And so what it is that then occurred was that they took all of the women who were left, women and children, and they sent them to work camps, other work camps. And so my 2 aunts and my grandmother were sent to a labor camp in Austria. Well, it's interesting at the time because, as I said, the area that my father is from, they were bilingual, and so my aunts they were German speaking, and so at one point they were working, and one of the German soldiers had made a remark about Poles being uncivilized and not worthy of anything, and just creatures, animals, and not worth any humanity. And my aunt turned around and spoke to the German German, saying that was intolerable, and she insulted him, and she got the gun that was put to her head, and of course told, if you ever speak up again, then you're done. And so she decided that living was the better path toward valor, and so she didn't do that again. Now, of course, with Essen being bombed and destroyed, if you recall, my uncle, who was Polish as opposed to German in the Polish army, he was happened to be a slave laborer, and he was sent to the same place that my father happened to be. So they were friends, so they became friends, my mother's uncle and my father. And so when my mother's family was being bombed in Essen, their Polish brother had contacted his sister, his German sister, and said, we are here and we are prisoners in a farming community, and the bombs haven't come here yet. So why don't you all come here and see if you can find rooms? And so, of course, that's exactly what it is that my mother, her 2 aunts and stepfather, and her mother did. Okay. Now, this was not a great place to be. Remember, my mother is partially Russian. She has a Polish heritage. She has an uncle who is Polish, and she and her family moved into a Nazi community. She said that that she was in this community. She encountered mayor or the Burgermeister and said, Guten Tag, good day. My mother was a very nice, she was only 14, and she was a very nice sing-songy type person. And she was slapped and said, our greeting of the day is Heil Hitler. And because they were outsiders, they were treated very badly. My mother was sent like to pick sugar beets and had to walk 10 kilometers a day by herself, not allowed to go to school. Ultimately, my grandmother offered to take her place in the field so my mother could walk to school. And she only went to school probably for another year. But, everybody had to work the fields, and the Germans who came from the city were not treated at all very well. In fact, they were treated as outsiders and not part of the party, and really they weren't welcome in this community. Okay. So this is actually the place where my father was a slave laborer. It is the farm of a man named Georg Heimel. The Heimel family is still in this community. My family showed me this is the barn, and this is, of course, where the slave laborers slept. And then they did the work in the fields. They were not allowed to associate with the Germans. That is, if they were in the room, they had to turn their backs to the Germans at the table, and obviously the members of the community who were enforcing all of the rules and regulations. There was, of course, an anti-fraternization policy. And if it was broken, then, of course, the Polish prisoner would be shot. Well, of course, interestingly enough, this is where my mother and her mother took a room, and this is across the street from the Heimel farm. And the way my mother and father met was that they were both working on the Heimel farm. Now, my mother, of course, was 14. My father was substantially older. My father was a young, strong, good-looking man. And when you're 14, I guess that's all that it takes. And my mother developed a tremendous crush on my father. It was, of course, an odd situation because, they have an anti-fraternization policy, but keep in mind, my mother's Polish uncle is also across the street in that farm. Okay? And he's Polish and he's not German, and yet not allowed to talk with him because of the lack of ethnic purity. And I suppose if you're checking DNA, I mean, my mother didn't have a drop of German blood in her. But nonetheless, you were across the border when Hitler declared war. And so you were either one or the other, and that's how things went. So my parents, of course, they spent the rest of the war there in the small community. In 1945, the Russians rolled in, and they again said to my father, "Hey, the war is over, you can go home now." Okay? And then, of course, they lived happily ever after. Of course, that did not happen. It never happens in that way. In Krasnobrud, Civil War broke out. And the reason that Civil War broke out is because the partisans are angry at the collaborators, and they're angry at the communists, and they're angry at people who went to Germany. They're even angry at the slave laborers for going. And so everybody started killing each other in the Civil War. And so my father's family, that he was not able to contact until probably a year after the war, they said, "You don't come back now. Right? They will kill you if you come back." And so he wound up staying in Germany. His family did not return to Krasnobrud. There was really no Krasnobrud to go back to. It had really only a church and one building that was left. And so his family actually moved to a nearby community where they had friends and relatives. In terms of Krasnobrud itself, it's hard to say. I think, as far as I know, there was at least one person who survived and ultimately went back, but nobody was alive. There was a handful of people that were alive. And so even if there was something to go back to, there weren't a lot of people who were able to go back to it. Okay. So my father stayed in the small community, and he was obviously a displaced person. The Americans had an Air Force base there. My father took a job on the Air Force base. Ultimately, he and my mother did get married there, and so they stayed in the area. They were displaced refugees. Essen was gone, so my mother did not have a home to go back to in Essen. Germany, as you can imagine, had no currency. It was filled with people just, wandering the streets without families, without any ability to get back to where it is that they wanted to be. There was the only way to get things done was to trade, to trade your work for food or to trade sewing for something. And so that's how it is that these people survived in the community. My mother's two brothers did survive the war. Intriguingly enough, the fact that my mother did have a Russian surname, that her father was Russian, worked out well for her older brother, who was captured by the Russians and spoke Russian. And so he was able to do well as a prisoner of war of the Russians. Her younger brother actually wound up he was in Egypt, and he didn't come home until like 1950. They didn't know what had happened to him because, and it was one of the funnier things, at the end of the war, when the war ended and they were asking people who it is, what their nationality was, he accidentally said he didn't know what they were asking. And he thought that the right answer was that he was a communist, and that was the wrong answer. And so they kept him in prison for another 4 years. So you had a little bit of a language barrier. But he said he had the opportunity to spend time in Egypt. And so I suppose, at least in retrospect, it might have not been good at the time, but in retrospect, it turned out that it wasn't really all that terrible. Okay. In 1951, the Americans left the Air Force base. And as you can imagine, my father didn't much care for the Germans or the Nazis, and he refused to take a job or stay in Germany. And so then through the International Refugee Organization, he had the opportunity to come to the United States. This was one of the things that they were given on the boat that came over to the United States, which happened to be a military transport ship. And you can see on the bottom, America, 1950, and there's a man, a man with a bag of money there. And, so it's basically saying, in Europe, you have nothing, but you come to the United States and look at all the money you're going to have right away. And then, of course, and they lived happily ever after, right? Yeah. Well, no, that didn't happen either. We all know that didn't happen either. Okay. So this is, I can tell you all the things that the details of all the things that are the complexities of what it is that you have when you have parents who have gone through something like this. And make no mistake about it, if you have parents that go through this, they are never okay. I mean, they aren't okay. They try to be okay, but they're never okay. And I don't necessarily think that they're children.
I got your email here from CSU.
Right. We have some.
Yeah.
Are you okay?
Right.
Yes, I'm watching the video with Karen Mika.
Can we mute? Can we mute that, Jonathan? All right. Okay. All right. So in any event, so I come out of this and, I couldn't, you're always trying to find what your place happens to be. And I have to say, my father wasn't a big talker. All the details I'm telling you now, it took me 55 years to get these. He really didn't want to say all of the things that happened. I heard a lot from my mother second, but, I never got a chronological story. So I couldn't figure out any of it. I couldn't figure out, why people were doing what to whom. And I don't think I have a better answer for that now. And so, I spent a great deal of time after the age of 18, and then, of course, into my 20s, thinking and researching. And I did some writing about it, and I did some researching about it. And, I have to say that I can't even say that I had a lot of knowledge about the details of the Holocaust. What I knew was that this was a war and a situation that had devastated a continent, and if not the world, and generations as it related to that devastation. And so as I did my research, I found it in different ways. And remember, we didn't have the internet. And so, what I did and what I found was I actually found this, and this is the YIT score for Krasnobrud. And all of the Jewish communities have a YIT score book, and it basically is the first person stories of what it is that they witnessed during the war in the Nazi invasion. And of course, my problem with this YIT score was it was in Hebrew and Yiddish, and obviously I don't speak Hebrew and Yiddish, or maybe not obviously, but I don't speak Hebrew or Yiddish, and so I had to have it translated. And so I still have that translation. And of course, it told me a lot more about the community than my father ever let me know. And it, of course, made me more zealous for knowledge. Well, in the 1990s, I started, of course, teaching legal writing. And many of you who have been here for 50 years might know this guy. And this is Andy Gross. And Andy Gross is a longtime professor for Cleveland State University. And I would see Andy in the hallway. And on one occasion, Andy stopped me and he says, you look so familiar. And I told him, I work in the law school. He says, it's not that. He says, it's not that. He says, you seem familiar, but you can't be because you remind me of somebody. And then, he proceeded to tell me about his own story, which was that he was Hungarian, Jewish Hungarian, in the Hungarian ghetto, and how he and his mother escaped the Hungarian ghetto. And of course, we bonded over that, and we shared a lot of stories, and I shared stories about my parents. And after this, I had run into a student, and she also, her parents, her mother was she was Sephardic, and her parents were from Germany. Her mother was actually more German than my mother, but her grandfather had joined the SS and actually shot her grandmother in front of her mother, which of course caused her mother to flee. And so we, of course, bonded about those stories, and we actually put together a conference at the law school, and it was, 25, maybe close, maybe 25 years ago. And it was about, social justice and trying to make the world a better place. And at the conference, I ran into this guy. And for those of you who are, again, Cleveland State long-term employees, this is Zev Harrell. And he's another professor at Cleveland State. And, Zev came to my presentation, and afterwards he said he wanted to talk to me. And, so, we talked together, and then, he told me about his experience at Auschwitz and how he had survived Auschwitz. And he said, it's rare that somebody who is your age, understands as well as you do about this experience in the way that you do. And he was the one who said, are you familiar with epigenetics? And I said, well, yeah, no, not really. And he had said that he believed, and I think science supported a way that the trauma of the past, of course, imprints itself on generations in the future, even though the people were not actually experienced that. And he says, he said he thought that this is what it is that I had a sense of. And he, of course, recommended to me that I join various organizations, including the Kol Israel second generation survivors, which I did. And, I've been a part of the community ever since. Well, it's, again, I don't want to take too much time. I want to get to the end of this because there is a little bit more meaning in relation to what is happening today in our world. And here we now have, of course, George Santayana. And this is probably the most often cliched used quote that you're going to see pretty much ever. And the problem with this quote, and there's a couple of problems with this quote. And, the one is, I suppose, Santayana himself. Santayana wasn't writing about anything. He was writing a philosophy. And so it's really a more general comment, which is a truism as opposed to there's a great lesson. Santayana actually left the United States and was in Italy during World War II. And after World War II, Santayana never said, oh, and look, here's my quote, and let's take a look at Nazi Germany as an example of all of this. He never said that. Now, of course, he was older, and there is some truth to the fact that he too was perhaps anti-Semitic and elitist, and possibly was not the best person to be quoting for at least the lessons we have in history. But nonetheless, I think that he, not only is he right, but of course, it's nothing new. If we don't learn from the past, we're not going to be able to improve it. But of course, the fact of the matter is we're not learning at all from the past, because that's kind of the nature of humanity. And one of the reasons that it's the nature of humanity is because the older generations who lived through some of this stuff have died. And as opposed to when I grew up and every other person was a World War II survivor who could admonish and warn the current generation about the horrors of war. Those folks are gone now, or they're quickly gone. And frankly, when you get beyond the first generation and the second generation and you get into the next one, it's not that we want to forget the past. I just think that it's just the nature of how it is that we live. And so the question is, well, what does this have to do with the law? Okay? And, we are not in a society, I suppose, that is a kind society or a civil society. I think that we often throw a lot of blame around. I don't necessarily think that our society is much different than any other society has ever been. I think that we know more about it, possibly because we have more means of communication, and I suppose more freedom to say exactly what it is that we want at any given time period. Now, certainly as attorneys and as teachers or as good citizens, we are always looking for ways to try to improve this, of course, for the good of humanity, for the good of civilization. And I know, of course, that one of the things that we always talk about as well, let's talk about civil discourse, and let's be civil ourselves, and let's teach others to be civil. And I think that is it's a nice thought, but I don't think that it in of itself accomplishes very much. I think for the most part, especially if you're a law school student or an attorney or a law school professor, I think that we're pretty darn civil. We are the epitome of attempting to be civil, at least, or teaching civility. But the fact is that the people that you really want to teach about civility are the people that often really can't be reached. And that's never been any different throughout history. I think that we always point to Germany as the epitome of responsibility, and let's teach about why it's bad to be a Nazi in Germany, because Germany has acknowledged its role for the past harms and has paid reparations, and of course it has the memorials to what was done. But frankly, Germany is about as far right wing these days. Not, of course, what had happened in the 1930s, but, in a sort of scary way. And part of the reason that this is happening is, of course, we are not remembering the past. And one of the reasons we're not remembering the past is because the people are dying and they are gone. Okay? One of the reasons that Germany is still a pillar of being responsible and teaching responsibility is this woman, Angela Merkel. And frankly, one of the reasons that she was successful in doing this is because at least her mother's family is from the exact same area where my mother's family is from. And that was the area, of course, where the borders were shifting from time to time. And so she knows, and she knew what it was like to, frankly, have an uncle or an aunt that was across the border and now considered the enemy. And it was through, and has been through, her influence that Germany has maintained its ability to continue to teach the responsibility about the past. I'm not sure if that's going to hold true in the future. As you know, in this country, we have a lot of this going on. But I still don't necessarily think that teaching a concept or a past is going to be a cure-all for all of the evils that we have in society. I think that we are at a deficit if we don't have the actual people who have suffered the hardship to, I suppose, testify to that hardship. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to do, but I obviously think that it needs to be more expansive. I think that what we need to do is, and a lot of people talk about empathy. We need to be teaching empathy, and yes, that's true. But I think that what it is that we need to do is we need to somehow educate people into understanding that everything is connected. World War II and what happened with Hitler. I see connected is misspelled on there, but I didn't create that. World War II, it not only destroyed my parents' lives, and they were never okay, but we took out the next generation too. I would never claim to be okay. I am not okay. I have an incredible amount of baggage from my parents' experience, and I think that's going to be true from anybody who had parents who lived through that particular experience. So I suppose if we had time, we would talk about how do we do this, and we do have to dedicate ourselves to trying to revamp our educational system so that we have an intellectual curiosity about what is happening with other people. And an intellectual curiosity about their experiences, but also, an overwhelming, overriding need to understand that, the harm that we cause to others is a harm that we are causing to ourselves. Now, I'm obviously open to lots of ideas on how to accomplish that. In conclusion, just wanted to point this out, and this brings things, my epigenetic full circle, I suppose. In Poland, when the Nazis invaded, they didn't just kill the entire Jewish population, they wiped out every vestige of the history of the Jewish people. So for instance, in Krasnobrud, the synagogue was burned, the old cemetery was turned over. This is the new cemetery in Krasnobrud. And I have to tell you that when I heard that the Nazis had like eradicated all of this history, and first of all, it was just hard for me to believe that it could have been accomplished in the way that they did, but they did. And they eradicated all the history, so much so that at least 20 years ago, I had, relatives who visited Krasnobrud, and, Krasnobrud even knew that they were 40% Jewish at one point, which I think is, tragic, not just for purposes of the Jewish population, but I think it's tragic for everybody to not understand just how much of a heritage and an interconnected history that you have. So this is actually the Jewish cemetery from Krasnobrud. And I think, at least for 25 years, I've just been so aghast by the fact that this is the cemetery. You can see it's a parking lot and a hill. I've wanted to do something about the cemetery. And and I didn't really know how in the world you do it, especially from afar. And this through, kind of fortuitous connection, I have been able to connect with the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland. And I do have, I had hoped to have it by now, but I do have a plaque that now is going to go up, and it is going to honor the Jewish community of Krasnobrod and, likewise honor my father. Because, even though my father was not Jewish, their fates and what it is that happened there in Krasnobrod and of course Europe are so interrelated. And I hope, if I live long enough, I can do a little bit more of that and expand the memory of the history in Europe, because obviously to the extent that we can remember the history, then maybe indeed we do have a little bit of hope for the future. I'm a rather cynical person, but I don't think that we have to stop trying. And so I will attempt to end on a positive note and say, well, I hope that we will have hope. And that is all. So that is my presentation. I will stop sharing. I know that it's now 1:01, but I don't know if Jonathan wanted to.
I'm happy to stick around, and for anybody who wants to stick around. So if you have questions or comments, you could raise your digital hand. That we have, Karen, can you see people who've raised their hand?
I see Mary Beth, you have a hand. I don't know if that's a raised hand or a clapping hand.
Well, it was a clapping hand, but I won't let that stop me. First of all, good to see you and thank you. And I think, I don't know if you have any insights on this, but I think one of the challenges we have, as you know, I always say, I am at the age where I'm astonished on Jeopardy how much I know just because I lived it, and and other people don't. And I was born well after World War II, but it was still part of the national conversation, because so many people alive then had lived through it. And I wonder about this concept of teaching empathy when you do not have the witnesses anymore.
And that is the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I read somewhere that bringing babies into a classroom was a good way to teach children empathy. And I wonder if we see some of that happening as multi-generational families disappear, because we don't have access to multiple generations. We only live within our own layer. So
yeah, and even now, and I understand several of the European countries have field trips to Auschwitz, and obviously it's a very emotional experience. But even my children, basically my children were raised in my parents' house, and they certainly had an extreme amount of knowledge about the situation, an extreme amount of empathy. But it's not anything like, your day to day. I mean, honestly, I have visceral physical reactions to what's happening with Ukraine right now. And I don't know how it is that you give that to other people. And until you can give that to other people, I don't know how it is that you can stop 20 years from now the next war that comes up and says, oh yeah, I want to let's go annex the country next door. I know with Poland right now, I mean they have visceral reactions every day still, because they're still living that war there, and they're worried. My cousin had said to me, because they're very austere still, and she had said to me, when you have Germany on one side and Russia on the other side, you never relax. And that's sort of how it is that they feel. Else? I see my friend Dan Oren is here checking in, and he's the one who has the connection to the preservation of the cemeteries, and I'm just so grateful, because I really spent so many years trying to figure out how to get that done, and I just never thought that it would have that opportunity. So it's good to see you. You have any words, Dan?
First, thank you for a beautiful and outstanding presentation, and for the meeting. I mean, I think what you're saying, I would love to, if there's a way for people in Poland also to hear your perspective, because I think a lot of Poles could learn so much from you, because you present it in a heartfelt and yet dispassionate way. So I applaud you for all you do, and thank you for sharing it.
Well, yes, I think that unfortunately so many of us have tunnel vision, and I got this perspective. I had the DNA test, and I don't have a drop of German blood in me, and of course my mother considered herself German because she was in Germany, and yet they suffered so much, and they suffered partially because of their ethnicity. And partially because they had a madman who was, running the country, and they never had a place. They never had a place ever in their lives, and it was worse off for their own parents. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at Poland and what happened in Poland, a lot of that happened because of their own anti-Semitism, and they didn't understand just how interconnected they were. So they weren't unhappy that the people in the Jewish community was being persecuted, because it wasn't them, right? But their fates were so intertwined, and they didn't recognize it at the time. And I think that really the key to peace on earth, something that I will never have the opportunity to see, is to understand that your fate is interconnected with those very people, that you don't care what's going to happen to them as long as it's not you.
Other questions or comments?
All right. Well, thank you for attending. At least we have, 9/10 of this recorded, right? So I will.
Exactly, most of it.
But yeah, thank you all. Thank you all for coming. It was, I hope to take my show on the road and do it in other places as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Mika. Really excellent presentation. Really insightful, sharing your personal history and how that impacts so much beyond that. So thank you all for coming, and we will see you the next time.